They watched it happen. The yelling, the manipulation, the control, the way your voice disappeared from your own life. They didn't stop it. They didn't speak up. They didn't even flinch. Instead, they sat there, silent, still, smiling even, maybe laughing, maybe siding with the one who hurt you. That's the betrayal no one talks about. The sibling who didn't throw the punch, but let it land. This is the pain you buried under 1,000 excuses. They didn't know. They had it hard, too. They were just trying to survive. But deep down, you remember the look in their eyes. You remember that they saw you and they turned away. That's what hurts the most. Not just what your parent did, but what your sibling didn't do. The protection you never got, the defense that never came, the truth they saw, but never named. You weren't just abused, you were abandoned. By the one person who should have been in the room with you, the one who understood exactly what was happening, because it was happening to them too. But instead of reaching for your hand, they reached for safety. Instead of standing beside you, they stood behind the parent. Instead of breaking the silence, they became part of it. If you've ever questioned why your sibling never said anything, if you've ever wondered how someone who saw everything could pretend nothing happened, if you've ever felt guilty for being angry at them because they had their own pain, if you've ever carried the double grief of surviving your parent and losing your sibling in the process, this video is for you. This won't be easy, but we're going to uncover what really happened. Why your sibling aligned with the person who hurt you. How that betrayal rewired your ability to trust, and what it takes to stop making excuses for someone who made sure your pain stayed invisible. Because until you name that betrayal, you'll keep doubting yourself every time someone turns away. There's a narrative we're taught to believe. That trauma brings siblings closer. That shared pain creates unbreakable bonds. That they get it even when no one else does. But in narcissistic families, that bond gets corrupted. You weren't teammates. You were competitors. For love, for safety, for air. You were assigned roles. The golden child, the scapegoat, the invisible one. And those roles weren't just unfair, they were weaponized. Your sibling wasn't always the villain, but they weren't your ally either. Sometimes they mocked you to gain favor. Sometimes they watched you get punished and said nothing. Sometimes they got rewards while you got rage. And over time, you stopped expecting them to help. You started calling that dynamic normal. You started mistaking their self-preservation for innocence. But here's the truth. Survival doesn't erase complicity, and silence isn't neutral, especially when it protects the abuser and isolates the abused. The enabler sibling doesn't have to be cruel to be complicit. They just have to do nothing while you're being broken. That's what no one warned you about. That betrayal doesn't always come from fists. Sometimes it comes from the person sitting next to you, doing nothing, saying nothing, letting it all happen. And when you looked at them, hoping for someone, anyone, to make it stop, they looked away. You weren't just hurt, you were left undefended, not just by the parent who was supposed to protect you, but by the sibling who could have stood beside you. And maybe now, years later, you still can't shake that ache. The ache of being unseen, not just by adults, but by the person who should have known, who did know. That ache doesn't mean you're bitter. It means you're waking up. You've been carrying two betrayals in one body, the obvious one and the quiet one, the loud trauma and the silent witness. You were the child who cried for help, while the other child walked away. And that kind of wound doesn't scream. It whispers, "You're alone." It whispers, "No one will choose you." It whispers, "Even your own sibling left you to survive it alone." But you're not crazy for feeling this. You're not cruel for naming it. You're not broken for still aching over what they didn't do. You were right to expect more. You were right to hope someone would step in. You were right to feel betrayed, not just by the abuser, but by the bystander. And now, you're finally allowed to say it out loud. Let's pause here to reflect. When did you first realize your sibling wasn't on your side? And how did that shift your understanding of the abuse? Let that memory surface, not to reopen the wound, but to recognize where the scar came from. Because the truth is this: you didn't imagine it. You didn't overreact, and you didn't deserve to be alone in the fight. So who was that sibling? The one who stood by, smoothed things over, or smiled when you cried? They weren't just surviving. They were becoming something else. Let's unpack the enabler's role, how it's formed, how it's rewarded, and why some siblings don't just protect the narcissist, they become one. Let's get into it. They weren't the golden child. They weren't the scapegoat. They weren't the invisible one. But they were something more dangerous because they kept the system intact. They were the enabler. Maybe they didn't scream at you. Maybe they didn't hit you. Maybe they didn't pull the strings, but they made sure the strings stayed in place. While you were surviving the narcissist's wrath, they were studying the narcissist's rules, learning them, mimicking them, and eventually enforcing them. An enabler sibling isn't passive. They're strategic. They've learned, consciously or unconsciously, that proximity to power is safer than resistance to it. That aligning with the abuser means fewer punishments, and sometimes more rewards. You know the type. They echoed the parents' version of events, even when it erased you. They played peacemaker, telling you to just let it go. They downplayed your pain, reframed your rage, softened the abuse into just how it is. That's not neutrality. That's betrayal. They became the narcissist's mirror, reflecting back the illusion of a functioning family. They became the translator, converting cruelty into tough love, manipulation into misunderstanding, and your suffering into overreaction. They didn't need to hurt you directly. All they had to do was normalize the hurt, just enough so no one questioned it, just enough so you questioned yourself. Imagine you're 10 years old. Your sibling sits next to you at dinner. You look pleadingly at them as your parent tightens their voice. Stop crying, just eat your food. Your sibling glances at you, eyes heavy with knowing, and then turns back to the parent, nodding. They don't comfort you. They don't look at you again. They say nothing. That moment isn't just silence, it's permission. Permission for the abuse to continue. Permission for the narrative to stay unchallenged. And it happened every time your parent told you that you were overreacting. Too sensitive, too emotional, too dramatic. Every time you were punished, not just for feeling, but for noticing. That wasn't just your parents' voice, it was theirs too. Why does this happen? To answer that, we need to go deeper than dysfunction. We need to understand the psychology of betrayal. At first, the enabler is just another child trying to survive. They learn how to avoid punishment, how to read the parents' moods, how to say the right thing at the right time. They see what happens when someone resists, and they vow not to be that person. This is known as identification with the aggressor, a psychological defense mechanism first outlined by Anna Freud. Instead of fighting the abuser, the child becomes like them, not because it feels good, but because it feels safer than being the target. Over time, that adaptation becomes identity, and when the parent notices their loyalty, they reward it with approval, attention, or at least reduced scrutiny. That's how the grooming begins. That's how enablers are born. But here's the darker truth. Some of them don't stay enablers. Some of them become narcissists too. This isn't just mimicking behavior, it's grooming into character. As Gabor Mate explains, children will choose attachment over authenticity every time, even if that attachment requires becoming someone they're not. So the enabler trades empathy for control, truth for loyalty, selfhood for approval. They see that emotional detachment is praised, that criticism earns respect, that domination is mistaken for strength, and they adopt those tools themselves. By adulthood, they're not just defending the parent's legacy, they're repeating it in their own relationships with their own voice. You may have noticed it. The sibling who minimizes your pain, even now. The one who parrots your parents' catchphrases. The one who gaslights you with a smile. They weren't always like that. But the grooming worked. They learned that power protects. And once they tasted it, they stopped asking questions. Alice Miller once wrote, "The true opposite of depression is expression." But in your family, expression was punished and repression was rewarded. Your sibling learned this lesson earlier than you did. They didn't just repress their own needs. They helped erase yours. They told you to be quiet, to forgive, to stop causing trouble, not to help you heal, but to maintain the story that kept them safe. And when you began to pull away, they didn't follow, because leaving meant losing proximity to power. And they'd rather be cruel than vulnerable. This is what people don't understand about family betrayal. It's not always loud. Sometimes it's a quiet, calculated decision to stand beside the abuser and call it keeping the peace. And that silence, it cuts deeper than words. Because while the narcissist hurt you, your sibling let it happen. Worse, they helped make it look normal. Think back to your own family. What patterns did your sibling reinforce, deny, or excuse on behalf of the narcissistic parent? And when did you first realize they weren't confused? They were complicit. How do systems like this survive? How does an entire family gaslight itself into calling trauma tradition and betrayal just the way it is? In the next section, we're going to dissect the inner workings of that system and the invisible role your sibling played in helping keep the illusion alive. Let's unpack that now. Some betrayals aren't loud. They don't come with slammed doors or shouted lies. Some betrayals are quiet, structural, and the enabler sibling is often its most committed architect. They didn't just stand beside the narcissistic parent. They stood between you and the truth. You thought they were staying neutral, but neutrality in an abusive system isn't harmless, it's complicity. Every time they told you to calm down, every time they laughed along, every time they changed the subject when things got too real. They weren't avoiding conflict, they were protecting the myth. the myth that your family was fine, that your parent was doing their best, that the problem wasn't the system, it was you. And over time, you started to believe it. Jean-Paul Sartre called it bad faith, a form of self-deception where people surrender their moral agency in exchange for social safety. Not because they're evil, but because facing the truth would require action they're not ready to take. So they stay. They smile, they smooth things over, and they call it keeping the peace. But what peace? When the price is your sanity, your story, your ability to trust your own mind, that's not peace. That's preservation, not of the family, but of the illusion. The enabler sibling didn't just allow the narcissist to operate unchecked. They kept the system functional. They reinforced the unspoken rules. Don't confront. Don't expose. Don't disrupt the story. And when you broke those rules, when you cried out, pushed back, or spoke the truth, they didn't support you. They punished you. Not with violence, but with distance, with silence, with shame. You became too much, the dramatic one, the sensitive one, not because your pain wasn't valid, but because your truth threatened the machine. Hannah Arendt once wrote about the banality of evil, the idea that cruelty often doesn't look like a monster. It looks like bureaucracy, like protocol, like people doing what they're told, because that's what keeps them safe. In a narcissistic family, that evil becomes invisible. It wears a smile, it calls itself family values. And the enabler sibling, they become its HR department. They don't question the rules, they enforce them. You may have seen it firsthand. The sibling who told you to forgive, before the apology ever came. The one who acted like nothing happened after your breakdown. The one who sided with the narcissist during every conflict, even when they knew the truth. They weren't just trying to avoid drama, they were preserving power, their own and the narcissist's. Because in abusive families, power is a limited currency, and siding with the survivor means losing access to comfort, protection, and approval. So they chose the system, they chose the story, they chose themselves, and you were left with the fallout. Not just the original wound, but the echo, the part where the people who should have seen it didn't. Or worse, they did and stayed silent. You weren't just hurt, you were erased. What makes this betrayal even more insidious is that it doesn't stop in childhood. The enabler sibling often carries the system with them into adulthood. They keep the family story intact for outsiders. They retell history in a way that paints you as unstable, dramatic, or ungrateful. They punish you for going no contact or for speaking openly about your pain. They say things like, "You need to let it go," not because they care about your healing, but because your truth is a threat to the lie they've built their identity on. In this way, the enabler sibling becomes a custodian of the family delusion. They guard it, repeat it, protect it, at your expense. Sometimes they even escalate, especially when the narcissistic parent ages, weakens, or dies. The enabler sibling often steps into the role themselves. What was once obedience becomes inheritance. They mimic the same control patterns. They triangulate, they isolate, they gaslight. Not because they're unaware, but because they were trained, rewarded, groomed, and now they uphold the legacy, not just of silence, but of domination. The narcissistic family isn't a collection of individuals. It's a system, a psychological ecosystem where survival depends on your ability to abandon the truth. And the enabler sibling? They didn't just adapt. They became efficient. They made betrayal a practice. They made compliance a virtue. And in doing so, they became more than passive. They became part of the machine. Let's pause here to reflect. Where did your sibling's loyalty go? And what truth about your family did that loyalty bury? Because that's the real damage here. It's not just that they didn't help. It's that their help went somewhere else. Toward the abuser. Toward the image. Toward the preservation of a myth that demanded your silence to stay alive. You weren't just abandoned. You were overwritten. So what does that do to a child? To grow up watching someone else uphold your erasure? To see betrayal coded as love and silence rewarded as loyalty? Let's go deeper into the cost of growing up in that system and how it reshapes everything from your identity to your nervous system. Stay with me. You tell yourself you've moved on. You've gone no contact. You've read the books. You understand what narcissistic abuse is. But somewhere, deep in your nervous system, you're still waiting for something. An apology, an acknowledgement, a single moment where your sibling looks you in the eye and says, "You were right. I saw it too." This craving isn't weakness, it's grief. Specifically, the grief of still wanting someone to see you, even after they've erased you. You didn't just want justice. You wanted witness. Someone who could validate the pain you didn't have words for at the time. Someone who could say, "You weren't crazy. I should have protected you." That longing sits like a ghost in the psyche. Carl Jung wrote that what you resist not only persists, but will grow in size. Unacknowledged pain doesn't disappear. It buries itself in fantasy. And one of the most seductive fantasies for survivors is that one day the sibling will wake up. They'll realize how they enabled it. They'll feel remorse. They'll call you, apologize, and finally see the child in you that went unseen. But this fantasy keeps you stuck. Because each year it doesn't happen, the silence feels like rejection all over again. This is the emotional hangover of trauma bonding. Not with the abuser, but with the system. And within that system, the enabler sibling becomes your last hope. The one who could validate your memories, undo your exile, prove that the story you remember wasn't a delusion. But they don't. And waiting for them to do it becomes its own form of self-abandonment. Alice Miller wrote, "The truth about our childhood is stored up in our body, and although we can repress it, we can never alter it. Your body still remembers what it meant when they turned away, when they changed the subject, when they said nothing after your disclosure. It wasn't silence, it was betrayal, and it wasn't a one-time event. It was cumulative. This is why the wound doesn't heal through logic. It doesn't matter how many times you tell yourself they were just surviving. Because emotionally, you were still a child needing backup, and they left you alone in the fire. And now, as an adult, part of you still walks through life with that burn. Still hoping that someday they'll come back with water. But what if they don't? What if the truth is, they can't give you what you're waiting for, because admitting the truth would destroy the identity they've built? For them to validate your pain, they'd have to acknowledge their complicity, their silence, their comfort at your expense, and many enablers simply won't pay that price. Because to them, the The truth threatens more than a relationship. It threatens their entire sense of self. Let's stop here for a moment. If you're still waiting for validation from your sibling, what part of you still feels invisible? What moment plays back in your head? And what would it take to let that version of you be fully seen by you? Because that's the reframe. The freedom doesn't come when they admit it. It comes when you stop needing them to. So what happens when you stop waiting? When you stop performing, hoping, or proving? You face the next wound, grieving the sibling you thought you had, and accepting the one you actually did. Let's talk about what it means to let go of the fantasy, not because they don't matter, but because you finally do. This is the part where it all changes. Let's dive in. Your sibling's silence was never neutral. It carried consequences. They protected the parent, not you. They rewrote your story in real time. They taught you your pain didn't matter. This wasn't childhood rivalry or family drama. It was betrayal by someone who shared your blood and knew your pain. Every time they sided with the parent, when they dismissed your tears, when they laughed off your fear, they chose the abuser over the abused. They didn't just fail to protect you. They defended the system, the status quo that kept the narcissist's control intact. Instead of shielding you, they shifted the spotlight away from the harm. They kept attention on the abuser's image. They preserved the narrative that made your suffering invisible. This is more than gaslighting. It's history rewriting. Your sibling chimed in when the parent said, "You're being dramatic." They echoed the parent's version of events. They flipped your memories until you started doubting them. They didn't just say it once. They kept saying it until you began to question your own mind. That impact isn't small. It isn't just family. It's erasure. You learned early on. When you showed up, you became a problem. Your sibling enforced that rule. They let your breakdowns cost them comfort. They let your emotions change the dynamic. And they punished you, not with violence, but with distance, a cold shoulder, a joke, a shrug. Each time taught you, don't feel, don't ask, don't need. This isn't what siblings are for. They're supposed to be safe, a refuge, a witness. But yours, they became a barrier between you and your truth. It's easy to write this off as typical sibling issues. Tough love. Families complicated. They had their own pain. But that minimizes the damage. You weren't debating chores or curfews. You were surviving emotional abuse, while your sibling kept the abuse going through silence. That's not rivalry. That's collusion. You've heard the excuses. They had it hard, too. They were just kids. Family pressure. But let's be clear. Their pain doesn't erase your own. It doesn't justify the choices that harmed you. You might feel guilty for calling them out. But that guilt? That's survival conditioning in disguise. It's not your job to protect them from accountability. It's not your job to fix family. It's your job to protect yourself. Pause here for a moment. Where have you made excuses for your sibling that you wouldn't make for anyone else? Work friend, spouse, even the narcissist themselves. What narrative have they used that you defended when you'd never defend that behavior for someone else? So if staying silent cost you this much, what happens when you stop? When you no longer need their consent to exist? when you walk away from a betrayal that reshaped your truth. That's what we'll tackle next. How to name the betrayal, reclaim your story, and hold your ground, even if they never admit it happened. For too long, you've replayed the same scene. You bring the wound, they ignore it. You try again, they shrug, again and again. But here's the deeper grief. It's not only what they did, but what they failed to protect. They didn't just allow abuse. They protected the abuser and left your pain unchecked. That's the real betrayal. The sibling who could have spoken truth, shifted power, or held you, did nothing. We're conditioned to believe we need approval to validate our trauma. But your pain is not a collective decision. You don't need the world's permission to know what you experienced. You don't need them to remember it. You just need to remember it yourself. Viktor Frankl once wrote, "When we are no longer able to change a situation, we are challenged to change ourselves." Naming your grief isn't a concession, it's an assertion. This happened. I matter. My story counts. Simone Weil argued that unacknowledged suffering is injustice hidden in plain sight. When your sibling erased your pain, they weren't protecting peace. They were perpetuating injustice. Calling that out isn't betrayal, it's moral clarity. There's power in naming what happened to you, even in a system that refuses to acknowledge it. It doesn't make you spiteful. It makes you honest. This isn't about revenge. It's about grief. Grief for the sibling who never spoke up. Grief for the family that told you silence was loyalty. Grief for the version of you who still feels erased. Let that grief come. Let it feel like anger. Let it feel like loss. Let it feel like relief. Because grief isn't linear. It's not comfortable. It's not supposed to be. It's the system rebooting. Take a moment to think about where you are now. If you could stop hoping they'd admit it, what would you finally allow yourself to feel? What room would open up inside you once you recognize their silence as their choice, not your fault? Write that feeling down. Sit with it. Own it. Naming the truth is only the start. You've seen the system. You've identified the betrayal. You've faced your grief. Next, we'll turn toward what's left, releasing the roles, reclaiming your own narrative, and stepping into a future defined by you, not by their silence or their systems. Let's finish this. You've named the betrayals. You've named their silence. You've grieved the sibling who never protected you. Now comes the reckoning and the freedom. From childhood, you were cast in a role. The scapegoat, the golden child, the child who disappeared so the system could pretend it was whole. But now, you're reclaiming your story. No one cast you. You were programmed. And now, you're decoding that programming. You don't have to play that role anymore. Carl Jung said, "Who looks outside dreams. Who looks inside awakes." You've faced internal ghosts planted by betrayal and erasure. Now it's time to awaken. No more seeking validation from someone who protected its opposite. No more expecting empathy from someone who never had it for you. Every step now is toward your truth, not the illusion they preserved. You don't need them to witness your healing. Love doesn't require reciprocity. Growth doesn't hinge on permission. You can let yourself exist. Own your boundaries. Feel your anger. Claim your healing. They never invited you to survive. But you didn't just survive. You're choosing to thrive. For years you lived by someone else's story, a script where your suffering was the problem, not the cruelty. Now, you're writing your own. It's okay to write a version they'll never understand, to reveal parts of yourself that were hidden so long. Some will come, some will leave, some will stay confused because they're still invested in the illusion. That's their choice. Yours is growth. Simone Weil believed that attention to suffering is a moral act. When you turn toward your pain, you're doing something revolutionary. You're not forgetting. You're not excusing. You're transforming. You're the one paying attention now. Someone has to. Let's pause to reflect one last time. If no one else ever acknowledged your pain, what would it take for you to affirm it? For yourself? What would you do differently when you're the only one who sees the whole you? Is it asking for what you need? Feeling anger without shame? Letting yourself be seen? Your healing begins with the permission you give yourself. Comment below with this phrase if you're ready. I see the real me. Because your clarity doesn't need applause. It needs acknowledgement from the only person who's mattered all along. You. You weren't broken. You were made invisible. But now, you're visible. You're whole. You're free. And that clarity, from absence to revelation, is your revolution.